Thanks, everybody. It's great to be here at NWAC again, and such a great turnout. So, talking about avalanche risk, when I was thinking about what I would present this year, I thought about, over the last 30 plus years I've been in the industry, how have we changed how we talk about risk, and how have these communication strategies affected how we manage risk? So that's my topic for today. Risk communication is incredibly important because the way that we describe the avalanche hazard and risk, it has evolved over the past 3 decades I've been involved in it, but the language and terms that we employ really helps us understand the avalanche hazard and helps us define our risk management. So I think how we talk about it and how we communicate it is an incredibly integral part of how we manage the risk. And I'm talking really specifically from an operational point of view, but there's a lot of crossover into the recreational community, because we use a lot of the same tools we use to communicate risk. Just even, for example, using the Public Avalanche Advisory are tools that we've evolved out of operations. So this is the way we talk about avalanche hazard and risk between coworkers, whether it's in the office or whether it's in the field. And operation to operation, in Canada we have a sophisticated influx communication system where all the operations in Western Canada can talk to each other and describe what they're seeing out there in the backcountry, and I'll get into that a little bit later. But also how we communicate to the elements at risk. And the elements at risk we refer to, for example, the public, or in a guiding situation, the clientele, or highways, for example, it would be industry as well. So it's important when we communicate about hazard and risk to be concise. We have to be brief, to the point. It's got to be memorable. We got to be able to retain critical factors. So if we're sitting around in a forecaster's office in the morning and talking about the critical factors, those have to come to mind when we're in the field during the operational day. So we need to communicate in a way that we retain, but also manages all aspects of what we're trying to do to manage the risk. So in other words, our communication strategy helps to mitigate bias. It has to help to facilitate our understanding of what's going on out there. And it really has to improve our field decisions. And that really is along the lines of teamwork and how we work together in the backcountry. So I'm going to start out with just a brief case history which illustrates the point of where communication doesn't work. And so when I was looking at what are some of the kind of watershed moments where our communication strategies have improved, it's easy to look back, say 20 years, 30 years, or in this case, even just a few years, to see where the communication strategies aren't working. So here's just I was looking through some avalanche advisories. This is Colorado. This is the foothills of Colorado, Loveland, Berthoud Pass. In about a 6-day period, there was 22 avalanches that were observed by professionals and public. And a bulk of these were skier triggered. And that included avalanches up to size 2.5. In this one in the photo, for example, it's a 5-foot crown, skier triggered. And I mean, you guessed it. If you look at the bulletin or the avalanche advisory clearly defines what the problem area is. Mostly north aspects, near tree lines where it was most sensitive to triggering. And these are layers that are 2 to 3 feet deep, producing crowns up to 5 feet deep. These are deadly avalanches, very destructive. So my question is, why would people travel exactly where the problem lies? Like if the bulletin just clearly outlines it in black and white, here's the problem, and there's a raft of skier-triggered avalanches exactly at that elevation range on the same aspects, and I don't even think the skiing's that good. I mean, it's Colorado. So I'm like, are people just stupid? So it's really just so I kind of go back and go, well, from my point of view, how do we communicate within our operations? How do we make sure the message is clear? And I think that's really interesting. And when I looked at that bulletin, I was like, those forecasters did a darn good job of clearly outlining what the risk was. There was grave warnings in the text, and it was clearly, using icons, et cetera, et cetera. The danger was considerable for a while. They were dropping it to moderate, but still avalanches were occurring on these similar aspects. So I thought, well, okay, so one of the watershed moments really was when we started to refer to the avalanche problem. So I'm going to use that as communication strategy number one. We used to say, hey, there's 60 centimeters sitting over top of, a surface soil layer, seems to be most sensitive to triggering on these aspects, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But when we started to refer to, we said, oh, there's a soft slab or a hard slab or whatever. But when we started to tell each other that there's a persistent slab, not just 60 centimeters sitting over a surface soil layer, but there's a persistent slab or a deep persistent slab. Or today our primary problem is a cornice problem, or it's a wind slab. What we're doing is, the avalanche problem is a set of factors that identifies the hazard in the terrain. So what we're saying is exactly, okay, what's today's problem? Where in the terrain does that problem lie? How likely is it to be triggered? And if it does get triggered, how big is it going to be? So all of a sudden, this set of factors which describes the problem in the terrain just makes it that much clearer and memorable where the problem is. So now, if I go out there and I think the problem is a wind slab, what terrain am I going to avoid? Wind-affected terrain, lee slopes, crosswind affected slopes. And it just, instead of saying, well, there's a soft slab on that aspect, it's easier for me to, because I'm talking about what the problem is and what's formed that problem. So what I think's happened is the avalanche problem has informed users of a potential risk management strategy. It helps you define your risk management strategy for that day. So for me, that has really helped. So another communication strategy we use internally in operations is it's the run list. And what it is, that's where we open or close runs in a guiding operation for the particular day. All the guides get together in the morning meeting. And what we do is we take that avalanche problem, which is kind of our newer way of describing what the hazard is, and we very specifically place it into terrain. And we call it this process of name and blame. We give terrain features names, and they're memorable. We call it like Sally's shoulder, Johnny's chute, or whatever. We give a name to the terrain feature, and then we apply that avalanche problem to it. Okay, if we were going to take our people into that terrain, very specifically, would we ski that with our people today? So we open runs, we close runs, or we designate runs for further investigation. And so it's a terrain evaluation strategy. It's a risk treatment strategy. So it applies today's forecast to the terrain. And what that does is we do it in the office instead of when we get in the field, and that helps us manage bias and desire. So very clearly, we use photos, whether we use GIS mapping, a bunch of different tools, and we identify very specifically, not just, okay, today we're going to avoid slopes over 35 degrees and convex rolls. We found that by telling us that, we still get caught in avalanches. But what we tell ourselves is we're going to ski here and not there, very specifically. So we know where the wind slabs are, the persistent slabs. We know what terrain is windward and has less snow in it. And we have a strategy. We have a very specific communication strategy that helps us define our risk management strategy. For example, if we open or we green a run for that day, we can always close it if it's worse than we thought, but if it's better than we thought, we leave it closed for a 24-hour period. We kind of call that the 24-hour rule. If we close a run for the day, red runs cannot be opened in the field. So we have this risk management strategy, communication strategy associated with terrain choices. So what we have to do is we have to use our experience to visualize or imagine where the hazard is and decide how we're going to draw margins in the terrain, what terrain is safer, what terrain is less safe, and very specifically choose that terrain. So what that's done, that's probably one of the better strategies that we've used in this industry. And we call it rules of engagement. We have teamwork strategies also that are incorporated into key decisions, whether it's an avalanche control day, deciding how you're going to move your team through the day, or whether it's guides deciding how they're going to move their clients. We have what we call rules of engagement. So all decisions within the team require consensus. Every single person is required to have an opinion. So you can't just come there with your coffee in your hand and not speak up. You have to have an opinion. So everyone has a voice. You're required to challenge assumptions. What do we know and what do we think we know? And then any one person within the team has a veto. So what we've found is by having a very clear strategy for how the team communicates, these rules of engagement, it makes the process of making a decision more robust. So we have our kind of devil's advocate within the group. We have roles and responsibilities. We have a requirement to provide opinion, so that helps us with knowing what we know and what we don't know. And any one person, if anyone's uncomfortable, we don't ask them why, we'll close the run. So everyone has a voice, everyone has a veto. So these professional strategies that we use within meetings in a heliski operation, for example, a lot of these can be applied to just a recreational decision making when you're going out with a team of 3. It's important to know what you know and what you don't know. So by talking about the avalanche problem, we have a more clear, concise way of locating the problem in the terrain. By referring to the run list, opening and closing runs before we go out into the field, we kind of have a debiasing strategy and something that nips desire in the bud before we go out there and gives us a chance to have a logical approach and a logical analysis without staring at the snow. As I've said, I'm sure you've heard me say before, it's always hard to make a good decision at the top of the run when your tips are pointing downhill. So another communication strategy, while some of these have been going on since the 80s, another thing which for me was a bit of a watershed moment is this notion of speaking to and dealing with uncertainty. So uncertainty used to be this, it's kind of like an unexpected event. What don't you know? How do we define that? So now in our operational forums in the office, we actually have a very systematic process and way of defining uncertainty. So we ask ourselves, what are the sources of uncertainty? Is it the weather? Maybe the forecast might be different than it comes. Is it our knowledge? Is it new terrain? Is it new snow conditions? So we have very specific, we ask ourselves to identify what we know and what we don't know, and then we come up with a strategy for closing that gap in knowledge. So we call that knowledge source uncertainty. So if we know what we don't know and know what we do know and have a strategy for reducing the gaps in data or information, like maybe we need snowpack tests. Maybe if you look at the avalanche problem, maybe we know what the problem is, but we don't know the distribution of that problem over the terrain. So we have a strategy for identifying that. So by reducing knowledge source uncertainty, we recognize how much of our decision is based on fact and how much is based on assumptions. And believe me, for all of you, I'm sure you would agree, but in this world of snow, there's a lot of extrapolation from few data points. There's a lot of interpretation of the information that you do have. There's a lot of confirmation bias that goes on. Many accidents you can look back and recognize that decisions have been made based on assumption, not information or not knowledge. So now we target that much more specifically, and it's not a big deal to be uncertain. It doesn't mean you're a bad decision maker, or it's not a big deal to say, I don't know. But as long as you just can identify what you know and what you don't know, it helps you with your decision making. So I think that was another real watershed moment that probably only happened about 6 or 7 years ago in terms of formalizing it on our operational forums. What I want to do is just take a few minutes to go through a case history here, because many of you may be familiar with this incident. It's a heliski near miss that happened in the early 90s. And I've used it before in other courses and whatnot, but I like to use it for a few things because things have changed since 1994. How we talk about hazard, how we talk about risk, and this helps to illustrate it. So this is a beautiful ski run in the interior of BC. It's in the Selkirks, actually, on the eastern side of the Selkirks. It's north facing. Average incline of that big open slope is about a little less than 25 to 30 degrees. It's not that steep, but it does have some steeper terrain hanging over the slopes up to 40 degrees. So for intermediate heli skiers, it's a great run. It's 900 vertical meters, so that's about 3,200 vertical feet. So it's just kind of a classic, open, gentle heli ski run that most people don't complain when they get to the bottom and it's fluffy snow all the way. So they wanted to ski it, the guides, they thought about it. It's a crowd pleaser, obviously. But they hadn't been there in a week or so, and they had been dealing with the surface ore layer. So they sent a team of guides over to take a look, and they landed the helicopter the day before they skied it. And they could see, this is a crown at the top, they could see a pretty good slab avalanche had triggered a size 2.5. And it had taken up about half the start zone and slid right to the valley floor. So it was a good-sized avalanche. And so it looked like estimated the crown was about 40 or 50 centimeters deep. And so that was close enough to the depth of the weak layer. They wondered whether that surface ore layer had been taken care of there. So they felt comfortable to ski down from the run. And they did 3 tests on the way down. So they did a good job of investigating this. They took photos of it. They spread out across the terrain. And at the top, they did a roosh block. That was in the days when people still did roosh block tests. And for those of you who don't know what a roosh block test, you dig out quite a column of snow that's around 2 meters wide by 150 centimeters deep. And you go down to below the weak layer, and you isolate the block, and then you jump on it. Step on it and then gradually jump on it. And back then, people used to associate roosh block 4, 3, 2, or 1 being associated with skier triggering, and roosh block 5 less so, roosh block 6 and 7 more unlikely that you would have skier triggered incident. So in the first 2 tests, they found the surface ore layer down about 70 centimeters. It was visible, but it was well rounded, and they got a roosh block 6 in the first test. They did 2 columns side by side, both got roosh block 6. And then the next test down, they did 1 roosh block, and they couldn't get a fracture in the weak layer, jumping multiple times on the block. So the tests back then, interpreting the tests, given the information they had at that time, they decided the layer was there, but it didn't look like it was reactive to skier weight. And then they skied lower down in the slope to the bottom, and they found the surface ore large, standing up in a valley floor protected area outside the path of the avalanche. So they went back, and then they decided, given what they saw, they would open or green the run for the next day, and they went to it. So the first group landed, and skied partway down, kind of spread out the group fairly far apart, maybe even skied it one at a time. It's a long time ago, so I'm not sure exactly. But most of them were regrouped on this little bump, and the second group came in by helicopter. It's a long flight from one part of the range to the other. So the last 2 people were still trailing into the regrouping spot on a little bump partway down. And as the helicopter landed, they were getting out of the helicopter. and they triggered a large size 3 avalanche that went wall to wall, stepped down to the surface floor, and hit the valley floor. And fortunately, because the guide decided to stop in a safe little bump, I don't know how safe it is, but on that particular day it was safer. It made all the difference in the world, and instead of, they just had one person caught just in a little bit of debris as he was skiing up onto the bump, caught his tails, and otherwise it could have been 11 people dead. And so even with good safe protocols, skiing one at a time and being, spreading out on the slope and regrouping in a fairly safe location, the risk is there. And so the point of my discussion here is, I think now how we would refer to this condition would be different. If we said, is that first avalanche, was it a wind slab or a persistent slab? If it was, in retrospect, because they went back and looked at the crown, and it was a thinner wind slab that for whatever reason didn't step down to the surface soil layer. And even with the rounded surface soil layer, it was still triggerable from the ridge top by helicopter. So obviously this weak layer was pervasive throughout the terrain. So nowadays we would probably just look at the slope, dig down, find the layer, and if the layer was there, we'd assume the distribution is throughout. And we might do a test for propagation propensity, like an ECT or PST. And if we're seeing the crack go across the block in a single loading step, we'd probably give it a miss. So our communication of what we're looking for now is different than what it is then. And that's just a good example by referring to, the avalanche problem, by really identifying what we know and what we don't know. We don't know how it's going to react to weight. We know that that's a harder thing to interpret. We'd probably define our uncertainty as greater now than we would have then, and given the slope a miss. It's possible. So that's just an illustration of how communication helps us look at the hazard differently and define it differently. And we use these same terms to talk operationally. The Influx in Canada, there's tens of thousands of bits of information we look at every day, and people within operations are targeted to evaluate this and summarize it for the operations. But one of the key aspects of this is this validation aspect. So how do you know the information that you're getting from the snowpack is relevant? How do you know it's useful information? How do you know you're interpreting correctly? Well, the Influx in Canada gives us a tremendous opportunity to verify what we see by seeing what our neighbors see. So are they seeing what we're seeing? It's just a simple process of verification. Or conversely, we can identify uncertainty by look at the data set and go, are we missing something? Are they seeing something we're not seeing? And so that helps us capitalize both on this notion of uncertainty and on this idea of, are we making assumptions, or can we verify what we do know? So a big change in the Influx in the last few years is we're starting to talk not just about hazard, but more about risk. So how we're using the terrain, how we're managing the current problem. And we've come up with this thing that we call a strategic mindset, which we now communicate between operations in Western Canada. And what is strategic mindset? It's kind of it's an operational strategy that helps us define how we're going to use the terrain that particular day. And this really applies well to people in the backcountry. I'll just skip through this case history. The application of strategic mindset, where we say, do we need more information? Or should we travel in the terrain similar to yesterday? Or is today the day to step back and pull the reins in and have a more conservative approach? Or with additional information, can we step it out carefully? And so seeing how other operations are applying the strategic mindset helps us. Our neighbors in Revelstoke, hey, they're pulling back on the other side of the valley. Should we be pulling back? Why are they pulling back? You know, or maybe they're stepping it out. How come they're using a bit more terrain than we are? So our description of how we use the terrain has really, our description of our strategic mindset is a communication tool that started in heliski operations, and now it's being used in all avalanche operations in Western Canada, and is now being used by recreationalists just in their morning trip plan. It really is becoming a communication tool that's much more widely utilized. And it's utilized really specifically and carefully to communicate where you don't know exactly what the scenario is, but it's just that your degree of unfamiliarity is such that maybe today we should just pull back. Things look different out here than we expected. Let's just pull back a bit. So stepping back or stepping out strategically or carefully is a tool that we're really using well. So it gives us kind of a mental map for what the issues are and gives us an overall strategy that guides all aspects of our terrain use. It guides all of our decisions. So it's a big picture communication tool that we use in operations that we find incredibly useful. So my goal was just to kind of describe what I think are the key watershed moments in our communication strategies for talking about avalanche hazard and risk over the last 35 years. And these are the ones I think that have really influenced how we talk about it and how we change our perspective. And it's really helped shape our decision-making process, and I think made our day a little bit safer out there. So thank you very much. Any questions?
Yeah, come on up.
Can you talk at all about how some of these strategies change when you're dealing with like groups of recreationalists rather than professionals?
Yeah, well, I think there's certain strategies work better within recreational groups. I think the strategic mindset, some of the bigger picture strategies are really effective with recreational groups. I think the run list, sitting down at home before you go out, deciding where you're going to ski, and then looking very specifically at either photos or a map and deciding where you'd be exposed to avalanches and identifying and naming features that you would avoid. So, and agreeing, coming to consensus and agreeing on eliminating terrain from the day. Say, given what we can see in the advisory, what we think the conditions are doing out there in the field, here's where I don't want to go. I think that those two tools, like basically that terrain evaluation strategy and that communication strategy of a strategic mindset, I think are the two of the most valuable tools that apply very directly from industry to the recreational side. And I think the rules of engagement, like our communication strategy of everyone has a voice, any one person has a veto, challenge the assumptions, and make decisions through the process of consensus. You got to arrive at a consensus decision. It can't be majority rules. It can't be one person dominating. I think those strategies are very effective at the recreational level. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, we have a question in the back.
Colin, in my maybe nearly 1,000 surveys, I find very, very few people doing pre-trip planning of the type you're talking about. Do you have a nudge or an idea, an exercise that gets people to do exactly what you're talking about here?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a cultural thing, I think, because what we noticed in Canada is because we did it really in the heliski industry initially in the 70s and the early 80s. The heliski had very specific, morning meetings. Often in the ski areas, the meeting was more, the forecasters would sit together and decide what the plan was, and then they just tell the patrollers. And so in the avalanche courses in Canada, we started to adapt the trip plan forms. And that spread into the recreational market because it went from the operational courses to the recreational courses. And then they sold trip planning, you know, the little field books like the Harry Blue book, for example. CA has a similar one. And then I remember going to the Fairy Meadows hut in wintertime, and I get there and I was guiding, but there was a group, a winter's worth of morning operational forms filled out by all the recreationals that went skiing there for the winter. And I was like, oh, that's kind of irritating. And I was actually quite impressed by how thoroughly people were doing it. So like if they showed up to the hut and because the forms were there and people had done it in their avalanche course, they were using the forms. So I think it's a cultural thing. I think once you start, it's easy to keep doing it.
Yeah, a question in the back.
Do you have any idea how we can get InfoX down here? Because we'd love to have it.
$1,000 a year for a membership. Yeah, the Alaska, there's some operations in Alaska that were contributing to the InfoX. I mean, Cascades, it's not that far away. I mean, if a bunch of operations just started, one thing InfoX is it's a private for operators. So it's not a public information exchange, but the big benefit of it is all that information directly goes to the CAA. So Avalanche Canada's forecast uses the InfoX information. So in a sense, you get the benefit of it with the daily forecast because they just summarize the info from the InfoX and put it on the advisory form in the morning.
Yeah, we have time for one more question. Is there anyone out there? Oh, right up here. Might just be easiest to come up to the mic.
So since there's such a good network with the Info Exchange in Canada, was there any hesitation with professional groups getting into it and sharing information and seeing it as a competition between each other, or like how did you kind of get over that hump and get most people in there and using it?
Yeah, well, it actually started from the CMH. Back then they had 10 operations, and they had a very detailed information exchange between their 10 operations. And then, you know, there's fatalities, and one of the coroner recommendations was this process of what CMH does should extend to nearest neighbor operations. And so then all of a sudden the other heliski operators started to share with CMH, and then the ski areas started sharing, then the highways operations, and before you know it, it's basically every avalanche operation. And so it's kind of like just the professional standard in Western Canada. But there is also various information exchange programs that are recreational, like there's the Informal X between guides, and then there's also the MCR, Mountain Conditions Report, and that's anybody can contribute that if you have a avalanche course and a certain level of avalanche course, then you can contribute. I think in terms of how they've shared information, that's an interesting question because initially they just shared hazard information. Operations, not only did they not want to make it public because they wanted complete, absolute transparency between operations. So no one would hold anything close to their chest. It would be just kind of free and transparent information exchange. So they were just, weather, snowpack, avalanche data, just hazard information. And then they started seeing the value in trading information about how we're managing this problem, which that actually took quite a bit of teeth pulling to get that to happen. Even now, it's still done kind of on a minimal level compared to what you could do it. But yeah, so there is some resistance to exchanging operational information about exactly how you're managing the risk, because people sometimes look at that as being very terrain and site specific. So it would be easy to misunderstand that information as opposed to the hazard information. But in terms of making that public, yeah, it's when people sign a privacy confidentiality agreement when they agree to contribute to the InfoX. So that information goes public via the CAA, which is the experts that interpret the data in a way that it wouldn't be misinterpreted. So that's the idea.
Cool. Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.